It's too late. Bail-in has already happened. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John. Good to see you again.
Hello, sir. How are you going?
Hello. So bail-in's happened.
Bail-in has happened. I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, last year we did a 5-part series about this whole question of bail-in, about what happened in Cyprus and what the global elites want, via the G20 and the Financial Stability Board. Several MPs, in relation to the legislation that passed last year, it can't happen. It's not the intent. It will never happen in this country. Well, I have found a new discovery that bail-in has already happened in Australia, and it's actually well documented. But you just got to find where it has been documented. But this is the key revelation. Anyone who thinks this can never happen in Australia, it's happened.
Right, and just to be calm everybody down a bit, right? It wasn't in the last couple of weeks, right? It was some time ago. Yes.
So the bail-in happened 1892, 1893, in that depression. It happened in Melbourne. I mean, the remarkable thing is that once you sit down and study what happened in that depression, all of the things that we have been talking about, all the things that we've been seeing for the last 10 years, it's all happened from capital controls to runs on banks to stopping depositors getting their money to banks failing to bail-ins, deposit guarantees. Everything that we're talking about in the last 10 years, it's a repeat of history.
Okay, well, they often say history may not repeat, well, it certainly rhymes, but in this case, it looks as though it's actually repeating.
Absolutely. So I think what we'll do in this conversation is just to go back briefly over last year's content. We're going to talk about the IMF report that came out 2 weeks ago. They're saying that we need bail-in, and we're going to then talk, and we're going to shatter this whole myth and say, hey, this is exactly what happened in Melbourne, and who knows? Maybe it was an Australian invention.
Well, it could well be, and it's worth saying, of course, because a lot of the official line is bail-in can never happen. Okay, bail-in is impossible in Australia. The fact is, it has happened.
It has happened. Yep. Before we start, I have to say we have a loyal viewer who is from Melbourne. He is Cyprian. His family members actually lost money in 2012 with the Bank of Cyprus. Well, this viewer's wife says this can never happen in Australia. Well, I spoke to this viewer today and I said, tell your wife it's happened. And they're from Melbourne. I said, it's happened in your own city. So you cannot deny, and this is going to be a blockbuster revelation, because hopefully, because several viewers, I've been getting emails, you've been getting emails over the Christmas break, January, February, and these MPs are saying, don't worry about it, this is over there, this is not here. People should be writing back to their MPs and saying, hey, why won't you actually acknowledge that this stuff has actually gone down in this country?
And let me just, before you get into the detail of what we discussed last year, it's worth saying that I've got now more than 50 letters, right, that people have sent me, because what they've done is written to their MPs or to the Treasury, etc., right? And there's a consistent pattern to those replies, which is bail-in can never happen, and then they go and say, in any case, deposits are actually secured by the 250k deposit guarantee, right? So they're mixing bail-in and bail-out, and basically just misdirecting the conversation, right?
Exactly. And so I still get this question via email consistently. And just for the viewer, so the deposit and guarantee, you only use that insurance if the bank fails. Mm-hmm. Bail-in comes before that in the step process. So bail-in is a technique to, if the bank's running out of money, this is a technique to give them, to recapitalize the bank so it doesn't fail. So these are very different parts of the process, and you shouldn't get confused. If they don't do bail-in, if they don't bail out the bank and the bank fails, that's when they will trigger, or they may or may not trigger in the insurance. But if the government doesn't want to pay the insurance, they're going to steal your money to recapitalize the bank. So bail-in is actually a technique for them to get out of the insurance. But why do they have the insurance? This is one of the interesting things. So in the 1890s, the Premier of New South Wales, there were several bank runs in Sydney. He wanted to calm the horses, so he said the government will step in and actually guarantee the deposits. And this was actually a radical idea at the time, because Melbourne, the government didn't step in, and you did actually have a panic and bank runs like Northern Rock, what happened in England. This all happened in Melbourne. But once the New South Wales Premier stepped in, and it was quite controversial at the time, people calmed down. So the guarantee is not actual insurance; it's a psychological technique to calm you down so that you don't go in a stampede. Because if everyone went into a stampede, the system would collapse tomorrow. And so you may, if the banks fail, you may or you may not get your insurance, but that's not the purpose of the insurance. The purpose of the insurance is to psychologically make you think that everything's okay.
Okay, so John, let's sort of start the conversation about bail-in. So there are various sorts of liabilities, right? In other words, things like deposits, right, as well as other investments that effectively could be converted in some circumstances to equity in the bank at the point that it's failing.
Yes.
Yeah? And deposits in particular are interesting because they are seen as an unsecured loan by individuals to the bank.
Yes.
Right? And those, therefore, in certain circumstances, could potentially be converted. So your deposit could be replaced by shares in the bank.
Yes. Yes, I mean that's exactly what happened with the Bank of Cyprus in terms of 2012. And just to go through that, so deposits above 100,000 euros, 47.5% of those deposits were converted into equity in the bank. Now, I mean, I haven't, to be honest, looked at the how the bank shares have travelled, but basically, once you have those shares, you either go into the stock exchange and sell them if you can find a buyer, and depending on how much money you'll get. But at the point of the crisis, these shares are going to be not worth much. Now, if the bank is able to survive and prosper, maybe you'll make some of that money back if you can sell those shares. But other than that, you are stuck with these pieces of paper. And here's the thing: in 2012, the Bank of Cyprus survived. Well, one of the things we'll talk about today is when they did the bail-in Melbourne. One bank in particular, which we'll go through this example, the bank that took the bail-in ended up failing. So even though you got shares, you lost those shares in any case. So you lost your money whole as bowls.
Right. So just to sort of rewind history a bit, and more recent history, right, last year there was effectively a bill put before Parliament,
yes,
which gave APRA bail-in powers of some sort, right?
Yes.
And as we discussed in our previous shows, it was all very, very fuzzy deliberately.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Unlike some other countries like New Zealand, for example, or even in the Eurozone or even in the US, it's much clearer that deposits are targeted.
Yep.
And we know that the Financial Stability Board, the international board, included in their list of assets deposits that could actually be converted.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
So where we are in Australia is that it's not clear.
Precisely.
Right? And what we showed in some of our earlier shows was that, in fact, there is an open door, or at least a half-open door, that allows in a crisis deposits to be able to be effectively converted.
Yeah, so in terms of the legislation, the Financial Sector Legislation Amendment, Crisis Resolution Powers and Other Measures Act 2018, when it talked about conversion and write-off, you talked about the word instrument under the definitions. It doesn't define instrument. Is it a capital instrument? Is it a financial instrument? What does it actually mean? Very unclear. But one of the things the legislation does say is that if you are going to convert an instrument, the instrument has to say explicitly that the instrument can be bailed in. So whatever the prospectus, the terms and conditions, there has to be a clause in there that says that this thing can be converted. It has to be part of it. That's the prerequisite to be able to convert, to be able to bail in. And what we showed last year was that deposit contracts, the terms and conditions for deposit contracts, do not have these terms in there, but they have these get out clauses and say, effectively, particularly for the big four banks, if we are ordered by the government to change the terms and conditions, we can do it instantaneously, no forewarning, and we don't have to. We may put a notice in the newspaper after we've done it, but that is the lay of the land. So in the middle of a crisis, if they need to insert these clauses in the deposit contracts to make them compliant with the legislation, the APRA can order the banks to do it. The banks may say we've been ordered by the government to do it, and once they do it, then APRA can issue a recapitalisation directive and say, okay, now take the deposits. And then basically that is how a bail-in can work. And when certain advisors and senators reviewed the legislation, they looked at it, and some of these people are completely against bail-in, and they looked at it and they thought, on the advice of APRA, on the advice of Treasury, from their own brainstorming, they thought it was all secure. When I spoke to them on the phone, I said, did you read the contracts for deposits? We didn't read it. Do you know that the banks can change their contracts to make it compliant with the legislation? We had no idea. So now, here's the thing. If people were genuine in Parliament and they passed legislation and they made an honest mistake, we didn't think that the law meant this, but we now see that the law could mean this. Well, if I was a parliamentarian and I made a mistake, I would honestly come out and say, this is the way I interpret it. I made a mistake. Maybe there's another way to, maybe there's a different way to interpret this. I'm going to rectify this mistake. Certain people have so much pride, so much ego, that they can't admit on the public record, I made a mistake. And so some of these people are just saying, well, nothing to see. So my original position, which was nothing to see, they're still sticking by that, even though some of their staff knows, no, well, maybe they made a mistake. So that is the lay of the land. Complete denial from the establishment, from Treasury, APRA, RBA, parliamentarians, nothing to see here, but murkiness around the legislation, loopholes that you and I have found, and yet they all say nothing to see. So for me, I have a little bit of money in the bank, but am I willing, knowing what I know, am I willing to have a large sum of money in the bank? I personally will not, because I know that there is a loophole around this. And I think from your conversations last year, you spoke to several people in the banks and said, what's your understanding of this? And the banks say this is unclear. They went to APRA. Now, did anything come of those conversations, or they went to a dead end?
They went to a dead end. Essentially, we've got the Treasury and APRA essentially saying, no chance. It's not going to happen.
Yes.
Right? But we've got the banks saying it's unclear. We've got our own analysis that it's unclear, and we've got the international context through the Financial Stability Board and through New Zealand, I think, which is a really good example where they've made it transparent, right? Bail-in of deposits in New Zealand is on the table, clearly.
Yes.
They're following the international guidelines from the FSB, clearly. Here in Australia, we've deliberately obfuscated it.
Yes. Now, the government and the establishment says there's no chance. It's not our intention, and yet the IMF. So 2 weeks ago, they came out with their Financial System Stability Assessment report. Now, the report was done for 2018, but it was released in February of 2019, and there's a couple of very key paragraphs, paragraph 53, 54, in this, which talks about bail-in. Quote, more needs to be done to ensure that the authorities are well positioned to resolve a systemically important bank or to address a systemic banking crisis. While it is important to ensure, as in the case in ongoing work, that banks bear the cost of their own failures through an increase in their loss-absorbing capacity in the form of contractual bail-in instruments, the resolution authority should be able, upon entry into resolution, to convert or write down any contingent, convertible, or contractual bail-in instruments whose terms had not been triggered prior to entry into resolution. So basically what they're saying in this paragraph is to say that they want APRA, in effect, because APRA is the relevant authority, to have more independent power to trigger. So when they talk about entering into resolution, that is when basically the resolution of a banking crisis. So if the banks say we need to trigger bail-in, well, at that point, no matter whether the instrument is triggered or not, or if the terms allow for the trigger, they basically want more powerful for APRA. So, because basically what they want is APRA to have power that if there's a crisis, APRA can just shut it down. And they're basically saying, if you're about to initiate bail-in of hybrid securities or whatever the instruments may be, we don't care if the terms or conditions allow for the bail-in to happen. If you're in a crisis and you've got to move fast. And that's what they're saying in this paragraph, that the APRA should be given more power to basically hit the switch whenever they want.
Yep. It's pretty clear, isn't it?
It's pretty clear. But here is paragraph 54, because this is quite significant. So paragraph 54 says, the authorities, as in the Australian government, should also introduce an ex-ante funded deposit insurance scheme. Now, we talked about that in a previous conversation. We won't go into that today. But then here's the key part. And a statutory bail-in regime based on best international practice. Now, let's be clear. So we say bail-in is possible. The establishment says we're not interested. It can't happen. It's not our intent. The IMF in this report released two weeks ago categorically said, we want APRA to have the power to steal deposits. It is as crystal clear as possible. The IMF has laid down the law of the land to the government and saying, bring this in. Now, according to best international practice. Now, here's the thing. The IMF hasn't defined, from what I can see, what best international practice is. But based on your work and some of the conversations we have, I would go to say that perhaps New Zealand is best practice because it is the most transparent. I mean, they say that the risk of bank failure is on creditors, as in depositors and shareholders. It's not on the taxpayer. Caveat emptor, you bear the risk. You've got to do your own homework. If you've got money in the bank, the government will assume that you are happy with the risk of this bank, even though you have no way of assessing what the true risks are. But they are crystal clear in New Zealand. I mean, there is no way to interpret their regime of open bank policy other than what it is. So they have said best international practice, bring it in. Now, maybe the IMF doesn't understand that there is a loophole. Maybe they put this in thinking, well, bail-in's not on the table, even though we would argue that it would be. And I'd love to at some point maybe contact the IMF and say, hey, you said this, but did you actually realise what's going on? But anyone who says that there's no agenda here, the international elite have said to our elite, get your ship in order, get these bail-ins on the table because there is a possibility that our banks, as the property market falls, as unemployment goes up, particularly in the construction sector, retail, real estate, as people can't pay their bills, as defaults rise, if our banks get into trouble, and we're one of the first set of banks to be in trouble, well, what are the international bodies like the BIS and the IMF, they don't want our problems to collapse the entire global system, and so this is like a shot across the bow. If you've got a crisis of your own making, make sure it doesn't affect the rest of the world, and this is obviously why they say bring in statutory bail-in according to best international practice. But yeah, any of these people who say, now to be fair, the government didn't, so there wasn't a formal recommendation. I mean, there was this paragraph, but there was no, we recommend. There was no language we recommend, but they just said bring it in. Now, in the response to the report, the government didn't say anything about this. So they didn't say we agreed. They didn't say we disagree. They just had a basically non-response. So what is the real thinking of officialdom? What does Treasury really think? The RBA, APRA, the Council of Financial Regulators, they know what the international elite have told them. Are they basically going to say, get stuffed, or we don't want to play ball, or we will do it, but we just can't tell people because if we did, there'd be a run on the bank? So I don't know, Martin, do you have any insights as to whether, Wayne Byers and Philip Lowe acted like, good little puppy dogs in front of the IMF and say, yes, master, we're going to do whatever you say?
I think it's the way that we'll play it in Australia typically is we'll keep it as vague and as loose and as flaccid as we possibly can to give maximum flexibility, minimum transparency, and then if something comes up that they have to react to, they'll react. That's how I think they'll play it. So I don't expect to see any further changes to the bail-in structure based on the IMF recommendation, but it does put into sharp contrast the fact that in Australia we've got vagueness, ambiguity, right? Comparing it with what the IMF is saying, what the FSB is saying, what New Zealand is saying. If I were a depositor, I would still be concerned.
Yes, yeah. And the thing is that, in 2012, when the IMF put out some what was seen in the banking sector around controversial recommendations around imposing a bank levy, Labor did not hesitate to implement the IMF recommendation. So 2013, when Kevin Rudd came back as Prime Minister, Chris Bowen was the Treasurer, Penny Wong was the Finance Minister, there was a joint press statement by Wong and Bowen to implement a levy on the banks to help fund the insurance scheme, the deposit insurance. This was based off an IMF recommendation from the 2012 report. And then when the coalition came in, they had the Financial Services Inquiry, and then the bank said, get rid of this, and the coalition got rid of it. So even no matter what our domestic banks say, Labor has a history of doing what the IMF tells them to do. So we know we're going to get a shortened government because the polls, I think, are beyond any hope of recovery. So Labor's a good little puppy dog in front of the IMF. Anyone who has money in the bank thinking, okay, there's a loophole. We have an order from the one of the if you think about the Godfather, the five families in New York, the mob boss from Europe, Brussels, they've given the order. We have a history of compliance from those sort of international orders. So this elevates the risk. Now, we come to the juicy part.
Yep.
So to anyone in watching this, parliamentarians, I was sending this to a few parliamentarians, anyone who thinks that this is overseas, this is not us, it's happened. Now, how did I find this? So there is a gentleman called Chris Berg. He's done some work at the Institute for Public Affairs, but now he's a research fellow at RMIT University, and he did a PhD thesis about the banks. And it was actually a very interesting. So he looked at 200 years of banking in Australia and basically wrote a very detailed PhD. A lot of interesting things in there, and there was a whole chapter around that covered sort of the Great Depression, the 1892 Depression. And just out of interest, I thought, well, let me have a read of this. And there was a very juicy paragraph, and I'm going to read you this paragraph from. So this is Dr. Chris Berg, PhD thesis, 2016, about the 1892 Depression. Quote, almost every bank that had suspended in the first half of 1893 had reconstructed and reopened by mid-August of that year. However, the consequences of reconstruction were severe. Of the 65 million of deposits, or 65 million pounds of deposits held in the banks, which ultimately reopened, 9 million was converted into preference shares or indeterminable deposits. 42 million had been repaid by 1901, but the last repayment to depositors was made as late as 1918. So there's a few important things to say here. First is, when the banks got in trouble, the first thing they did is they locked the doors. So if you think of what happened in Mary Poppins when Jane and Michael triggered the bank run, what did they do? They basically closed the deposits and they said, you're not going to get your money. Well, that happened in Melbourne, number one. Number two is they had this process around what they call reconstruction. Now, what is reconstruction? Reconstruction was a process to keep the banks alive, but they basically said, this is a bad bank. Well, what we're going to do is we're basically going to collapse this bank, but you're going to effectively establish a new corporate structure. And that new corporate structure is basically going to be effectively the same bank, the same people, but it's going to be restructured, and that will hopefully try to continue. Because they didn't want... Now, quite a few banks did fail, but they want to try to keep as many banks as alive. But in this process of what they call reconstruction, which is collapsing one bank and then reconstituting a new bank, in some cases, the deposits were converted into preference shares. So that is the bail-in. The conversion of deposits to shares, Cyprus, now this was a reference to 1893. Because once I read this, I rushed to the University of Wollongong, looked in their library, looked at, could I find a specific bank, a specific example of where this happened? And then one of the examples I found was actually in 1892. But this is clear that there was a conversion of a conversion of deposits into bank shares. Everything we've been saying, it happened 1892, 1893. But even with these reconstituted banks, it still took, in some cases, up to 25 years to get your deposit. Now, so obviously they're saying by 1901, most of the £42 million had been repaid. So if you think from 1892, 1901, almost 9 years. You've got to wait 9 years for your money, but in some cases you had to wait up to the end of the First World War to get your money. Now, if people have got money in today and thinking this money is going to be my retirement, I'm close to retirement or I'm in retirement, well, if they shut the doors at the Big Four, it could. I mean, can you imagine, like retirees? I mean, they're going to be dead before they see them. If they've got to wait 25 years to see their money, that according to what happened in the in the 1892 depression, they're going to be dead and they won't see their money. And so yeah, so catastrophic stuff here. But so here's the quote. Now, you could say that this is one researcher, one PhD. Is there any corroborating evidence? Well, yes, there is. And here's the thing that perhaps you and I missed. The Reserve Bank, on their own website, confirms bail-in happened during this period. So here is a research paper by the Reserve Bank, 2001, and I'm going to read you a quote that references this period about the 1890s. A quote, shareholders were called on to invest fresh capital in the reconstructed bank and were released from liabilities for calls on unpaid capital from the old bank. The major part of depositors' claims were extended for long periods, generally for a minimum of 4 years, before any withdrawals could be made. And in some cases, these claims were converted into preference shares. Reserve Bank, look, I have an article coming out on my website. I'm documenting this. The links are there. The references are there. This is indisputable. The RBA confirms bail-in happened during this period. And again, if with this reconstructed bank, you had to wait many years to get your money. But now, that is if the bank survived. There are many examples of because in this period, there was three types of banks. There was trading banks, there was land banks, and these were the banks that funded the loans to speculate on land. So 1880s, 1870s, massive speculation on land, property bubble, just like today. There was a special category of banks that were focused on that type of lending, and a lot of those were the ones that went bust. But then you had building societies, and a lot of building societies went bust. So quite a few people lost money when the banks sort of collapsed. But the ones that they were able to reconstruct and make them survive, you had to wait a long time. You either got preference shares or you got to wait a lot of time to get your money. Now. So there's the RBA. Now the question then becomes is, well, can we find a specific bank that actually went through this process just to hit this home for the viewer? And I found I found the example. So if anyone wants to look at this, so there's a book called Land, Boom and Bust by Michael Cannon. The first edition was published in 1966. The edition that I found in the University of Wollongong Library was in 1972. It's an excellent book because it goes through a lot of. It actually talks a lot about the lead up. It talks about all sorts of banks that went bust, all the leading figures in that period. It talks about some of the social costs from suicide to prostitution. I mean, all of these things that we're talking about, all the things that Eddie Hobbs was saying about Ireland, this all took place in the 1890s here in this country as well. So what's the specific example that I found was that there was a bank called Australian Deposit and Mortgage Bank, and the person running it was a guy called James Balfour, MLC. At the time he's running the bank, he's a member of the Victorian Parliament. So at the time, because a lot of these Victorian parliamentarians were not paid, so they had private sector jobs at the same time as being people in Parliament. And so this was a person who was well respected. He was a member of Parliament. He was a member of, he had a strong reputation. He actually went to London, he went to Edinburgh, raised a lot of capital, and people said, well, we can trust this guy. Well, he was part of this bank. This bank failed in 1892, and basically it went through a reconstruction process, and depositors were offered initially preference shares with a 5% dividend. So what that means was, if you decided to take your deposits and then take them into shares, well, in this reconstructed bank, once we pay dividends, well, you will get 5% of your capital as a fixed income stream, and that's what they mean by preferences. You get a preference, your preference in the shareholder rank, and the initial offer was 5%. Now, this happened in March of 1892. Now, by July of 1892, it went through the courts. The courts approved the reconstruction, but they had to reduce the preference from 5% to 2%. So depositors actually got screwed in this process. Now, in March of 1892, a well-known newspaper in Melbourne called Table Talk talked about this example. And again, through the National Library, I actually found the article from 25th March 1892. It actually talks about the benefits of bail-in. And so let me explain this to you. So it says, quote, "The advantage of the scheme to shareholders was manifest, for it prevents the necessity of sharp and heavy calls." So what that's basically saying is bail-in is good because the shareholders don't have to throw more money at the bank. But then it says for depositors will get interest which they will not if they elect to be dealt by the liquidator, and they are not likely to get back their principal any more quickly than by taking fully paid up shares, negotiable soon in the open market. The scheme is certainly the most equitable for depositors of any company recently suspending payment. This is 1892, 25th of March, Melbourne newspaper saying, isn't this a fantastic thing? Because the counterfactual is actually worse.
That means that the idea of losing your deposit in a bank failure or a reconstruction, right, has got historical pedigree in Australia.
Yep.
Right? There's a rationalisation for it, which is not a million miles off the one that is being trotted out today.
Yes.
Right? IMF, Financial Stability Board, those people, right? Like, it's the best, most equitable way of dealing with a bank problem, but rather than putting taxpayer money in, right? That's the other option. But if I'm a depositor and I am thinking that my deposits are safe in a bank, this has to underscore again, they're not safe.
100%, they are not safe. So there's a couple of key differences with this example compared to what happened with Cyprus. So the first thing is Cyprus was ordered by the government to do it. This bail-in scheme was actually an invention of well, I mean, they introduced some legislation around liquidation, but it's also some of these deals around preference shares was actually instituted by the banks. So this is more of a private sector solution compared to government orientated. Now, in the Bank of Cyprus is still around. So now, when this particular bank, the Australian Deposit and Mortgage Bank, when that was reconstructed and had the bail-in, this bank went on to fail, and the depositors still lost their money. So now there are some banks in Melbourne that were successful. There were some banks in Melbourne that failed. The modern example, the Bank of Cyprus, is successful. So it could well be that the IMF and others may say, well, in the modern era, with all of this history, all of this experience, well, when we bail in, we know how to do it well, and we know that if depositors lose money and get shares, those shares are still going to be around for a while. But you know, how many people want to lose that cash, that liquidity into shares? And who knows? Because a distressed bank, the shares will collapse. I mean, you look at Anglo-Irish Bank, or you look at the Royal Bank of Scotland, they fall 80-90% in the midst of a crisis. And how long does it take for them to recover in terms of their value? It may be 10, 20, 25 years for you to wait around just so you can, you know, get the value of your savings, the fruits of your labor. But again, so to summarize the conversation, you and I have found a loophole that says bail-in is legal today. The establishments, you know, here's the thing: most of these politicians, they don't even read the laws that they pass. So when a politician says, most of these politicians, Treasury has come up with a script. This script has been circulated around Parliament, and this is what our viewers are getting. So, but have the parliaments read the law? Do they actually understand the issues? The answer is categorically no. And I've spoken to some of these politicians, and they have no idea what's really going on. And these guys in Parliament being paid $200,000 a year. Number one. Number two is the IMF has given the order, get your house in order, institute bail-in, because we don't want your banks to blow up the global financial system. And point number three, anyone who says this cannot happen in this country, it's already happened. So let's cut the BS. All of this propaganda about North and Adams are being fearmongers. I get this on social media all the time. I'm a lunatic. I'm a scaremonger. You've got a mental health issue. Go to hospital. I even last night, abuse on social media. Well, anyone who thinks that this is what happens in Cyprus can't happen here, I just want you to go tell them it's happened. It's happened once. It can happen again. We may have actually invented this whole the whole scheme, and people need to wake up, because Armageddon is coming, and the banking system has a lot more systemic risk than what APRA and the RBA are willing to openly admit.
John, thank you very much. Disturbing message.
Thank you.
Thanks. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Check back next time for our next instalment.